I'm just delighted to see so many of you here. You braved rush hour, you braved rain, and I really, really am grateful. So I understand that the event runs until 8, or is it 7:45 or 8? Okay. So I had planned to speak for an hour in order to leave half an hour for Q&A, but I might shorten it since we have until 7:45. I'll just say a little bit about myself, since I've just spoken to a couple of you in the audience, and I know that you've come from many different walks of life. So I'm a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and history at George Washington University. If we could just put up the first slide, I can go ahead and play it. Yep, thank you. And my work is about the relationship between law and sexuality. And a couple of years ago, while I was looking at the content of this magazine called Stree, which is the longest-running magazine in longest-running women's magazine in Marathi, I was surprised to see a lot of content about divorce, and that's what got me interested in the topic that I'm about to speak about today. I'm going to begin with an introduction that has been circulated. So divorce has typically been framed in Indian popular culture as available primarily to upper-class, Anglicised, urban people who have the financial means and the cultural capital to pursue long-winded remedies in courts. Critics of divorce have long framed it as anti-Hindu and a practice that is promoted by frivolous, Westernized women. As a result, escaping unwanted or abusive marriages has been an uphill battle for many Hindu women. Among the various Indian personal law systems based on religion, Hindu personal law, interestingly, was the last to legalize divorce. Divorce was ruled possible for Parsis after the Parsi Marriage and Divorce Act of 1865, for Christians in 1869 with the Indian Divorce Act, and for Muslims after the dissolution of Muslim Marriage Act in 1939. For Hindus, the legal right to divorce was formalized in 1955. So that's why my topic and the title focuses on Hindu divorce, because the period that I look at, the 1930s and 40s, was a time when divorce was actually available for women of other religious backgrounds, but not for Hindu women. So what I'm trying to do in today's talk is share with you some of the justifications that were used that specifically dealt with access to divorce for Hindu women. Now, the question I have today is, what arguments did the early proponents of divorce in this period, the mid-20th century, use to legalize divorce? And specifically, how did they seek to show acceptance for divorce in the shastras? I pursue these questions by looking specifically at Marathi public culture and this magazine, Stree. And I'm going to share a lot of stories, a lot of translated content, excerpts from letters to the editor, legal advice, opinion pieces, all of which give you a sense of this particular moment in history. Now, why look at Marathi public culture? It's important because a significant number of reformists and legislators who helped formalize Hindu women's legal right to divorce at a national level, such as Chimnabai Gaikwad, Dr. Gopal Rao V. Deshmukh, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, were Marathi. Bombay Presidency and Baroda, which was at that time ruled by Marathas, legalized divorce for Hindu women before the country as a whole did so. So by looking at ideas that were circulating in the Marathi public sphere, I'm trying to trace the itinerary of reformist ideas about divorce that gained prominence in the 1940s and then led to the national level legalization of divorce for Hindu women in 1955. So a few words about the source that I'm focusing on. Stree was founded in 1930 as a magazine focused on women, and it quickly became the largest circulating magazine of its kind in its first 4 decades. The magazine was not explicitly political. Its content was entertainment-oriented and pitched at multiple generations. It included short fiction written by prominent authors. It included reports and opinions on news events, memoirs and travel writing, advice on domestic matters, fashion, poetry, letters from from readers. And the readers were neither necessarily Anglicized nor wealthy. They were members of middle-class, upper-caste families whose women had access to education, but were typically educated in schools where Marathi was the medium of instruction. So let me just share some slides of covers from this magazine. So these two are among the earliest covers, and one of the interesting things you'll see if you go and look at the archive of the magazine is that many of the cover images often depict women reading, because part of what they were trying to do is also promote literacy for women. The magazine also very quickly popularized the romantic couple. So here are some examples of covers that convey domestic bliss, a kind of partnership between husbands and wives. You often find women portrayed in a kind of leading role. You notice that she's holding a book in her hand, and you'll see women holding books in the most unlikely places, outdoors as well. Stree's cover images popularized the romantic couple at this time. So what really fascinated me was that this was a magazine that also carried content about divorce, advocating access to divorce, even as it explicitly celebrated companionate marriage. At first glance, this may seem contradictory. However, both the content about romantic bliss and about the right to divorce concurrently signaled the realignment of the idea of marriage from treating it as a bond between two families to now treating it as a bond between two individuals whose primary goal was companionship. Stree content seems to suggest that if a companionate marriage was not possible, then divorce was justifiable. Now, of course, for many Stree readers, the prospect of divorce was quite alien. There was very little information about it, about its legal standing, and there were very few examples of real people who had undergone divorce. However, the magazine's contents show that there was a lot of appetite for this information. You may ask, is this an aberration? Is it just this particular magazine that had this particular tilt? But I found that that wasn't the case. If you look at the early 1930s literary context, there was a lot of emphasis on freedom in interpersonal relationships. Many Marathi thinkers and writers, including legislators such as V.V. Joshi, the sociologist M.D. Altekar, raised topics such as the necessity of the dissolution of marriage, women's economic independence, intercaste marriage, and they were all committed to the idea of freedom in intimate relationships as part of the general spirit of human freedom in all fields that was pervading the cause of political independence from Britain at this time. I turned my attention to the topic of divorce in the mid-20th century because I was intrigued by how bold the proposals related to divorce in this period were. This was well before divorce had actually become legal. And so I'm really struck by how much people are thinking about it and writing about it. So in this talk, I'm going to share stories. I'm going to share translated excerpts of content from this magazine that show how divorce was being imagined and discussed 15 years or so before it actually became legal or legally available for Hindu women. This was with the passing of the Hindu Marriage Act in 1955. And many of the translations are my own. Now, Stree articles offer a sense of how proponents of divorce sought to indigenize this practice by distinguishing it from what they perceived as Western excess. One of the most frequently used tropes by critics of divorce was that of a flighty Western woman who was just given to being frivolous and just asked for divorce at the drop of a hat. And so anyone who was a proponent of divorce in this period was burdened with refusing this association with Western women. Now, excuse me, among upper caste Hindus, the received sense was that Hinduism, and specifically Vedic shastras, treated marriage as an indissoluble sacrament. Although scholars had offered counterexamples of flexibility in the marriage bond, using examples from Narada, Manu, and Kautilya about conditions for dissolving a marriage, Orthodox pundits at the time ruled that Hindu rituals treated marriage as a sacred bond. Now, in practice, norms among lower caste communities were actually much more flexible. Customary forms of separation were available among Marathas. It was called kadi mode, which translates as breaking of a twig. It was also available to Lingayats in this region and Namoshudras in Bengal. When Dr. Ambedkar, as Law and Justice Minister in 1949, argued in favor of codifying divorce in the Hindu Code Bill, he actually argued that divorce was already being practiced as a custom among the lower caste majority, and so it should have been a no-brainer to legalize it. However, customary separation did actually vary from region to region, and the standards of proof used varied as well. And most importantly, they typically didn't allow women to leave intolerable situations without the consent of the husband. Among Marathas, for instance, the husband had to grant something called a sod chitti, which means a departure note or a note that allows you to leave, which confirmed that he agreed to it. Sometimes a divorced wife had to pay a fine to the caste panchayat. What was being proposed then in this period that I'm looking at was a new pan-caste legal standard for divorce, and a new Marathi term was also circulating called ghatasphot, which means breaking of a pot. Instead of the practice of kadi mode or the sod chitti, or also something called farkat ghene, which means separation, reformists were proposing ghatasphot, divorce, a new standardized legal right that was distinct from various customs and that applied to all castes. It's likely that they found its aura as a modern legal category that women could use preferable to the existing forms of separation, where men often initiated the separation. What is also evident in Stree is a real struggle between advocating for the right to ghatasphot and refusing associations with westernization. Opinion writers, as you will see, go to great lengths to caricature Anglo-American women. And the letters to editors are also at pains to show, portray women whose identities appear authentically Indian or domestic and that are not informed by Western ideas. Whenever any reference to marital practices in the Anglo-American world come up, they're almost always negative. So there were three kinds of sources. This is what I'm going to be looking at today. If you look at the genre of content that we'll be looking at. First, opinion pieces, then letters to the editor, and under opinion pieces, I'm including women's movement texts, letters to the editor, and legal advice columns. Opinion pieces often mounted arguments that were sociological, and they laid out scriptural discussions. Perhaps more effective were first-person letters from readers. They offered moving narratives of miserable marriages, and they were using a sentimental appeal. Apart from appeals to the sympathy of readers, Stree also shared advice about the neighboring jurisdiction of Baroda, which did make divorce available in the 1930s. Many readers were unfamiliar with it, but they were curious about it. And their questions illustrate what legal scholars such as Lauren Benton and Mitra Sharafi have called legal forum shopping, where people actually looked for whatever jurisdiction had the least resistance to whatever it is that they wanted to get. A quick note also on the education levels of the readers. I found a survey in the magazine conducted in 1955 that received 500 responses that gives us a sense of the literacy levels in the households that received this magazine. About 20% were graduates of colleges, 20% had passed Marathi high school final exam, and 25% had given up their education at various points, whether in middle school or high school. And the rest reported even less access to education. Half of them were married and lived in conjugal households, of which 41% were joint families. when it comes to caste, you can see that the authors featured in Stree were often drawn from upper castes, and I guess this based on last names. But the readership also did draw from non-Brahmin rural elites, as you can see from some letters to editors. And the relationship between non-Brahmin rural elites and upper caste progressive, the literati, was a really complex one. When it comes to this topic, there was actually quite a bit of ideological overlap, because both believed in rejecting traditional worldviews, rituals, superstitions, and adopting rationalist mindsets. So as Rahul Sarwate has argued, rural elites, lower caste activists, and upper caste progressives, in some respects, did share ideas that were typical of modernist, nationalist ideas of the time, discourses of this time. The focus was on improving people's minds and rejecting traditions. So the first foray in Stree into promoting divorce, this was an opinion piece titled Bandhamukta Ghatasfot, and it was in the very second year of the magazine's publication, and it was by someone called Sharadabai Chitale, who went on to become a Montessori educator in Bombay City. And it presents a really heartfelt personal engagement with a novel that had just come out the previous year called Bandhamukta, and that translates as freedom from chains or unconstrained. And in this novel, the protagonist, a woman, initiated a divorce. Chitale explains that she was invited by the editor to offer her views about this novel. And she says that even though, prior to reading this novel, she had no strong views on divorce, she found that the story that Bombay Wale told was so moving that she felt that she was now on the side of the protagonist who wanted a divorce. Chitale argues that when people realize that marriage is not a God-given tie or a Parameshwar Nirmit Bandhan, but a social agreement, a Samajik Pavitra Karar, they will abandon the notion that a woman must work in her husband's house for her livelihood all her life. Now, she does acknowledge at one point that she might sound overly Westernized. So she then says, I'm not arguing for frivolous Western-style practices. I'm just saying that couples should be given the option to separate and then see if they want to ask for a divorce. A year later, Stree published an article by religion scholar Gangadhar Lakshman Devdhar that was much more strong in its advocacy for divorce. Devdhar articulates a vision of how divorce was justified by Hindu shastras. The context is that he's responding to the news that the Hindu marriage dissolution bill had failed in the Central Legislative Assembly, and it had been defeated by those who decried it as anti-Hindu. This is 1932. Okay, so for those of you who are wondering why it is that Hindu law took so long to make divorce available when Muslims, Christians, and Parsis had divorce available, there were attempts like this, but they were defeated in the legislative process by those who said this practice is anti-Hindu. So what Devdhar does is he addresses the orthodox argument, and he says that divorce is not adharmic or against religion. He says that if we look closely at Hindu texts, history, and contemporary needs, you will actually see nothing scary or anti-Hindu. He translates a verse from Manusmriti that lays out the conditions under which a woman can remarry. After the death of a husband, if the husband seeks sannyas, meaning leaving home and worldly society in search of spiritual growth, or if the husband is impotent. He notes that if the ancient sage Manu had laid out scenarios where a wife could take a new husband while the first was still alive, then clearly he did sanction divorce. Devdhar also reminds readers that when the practice of sati had been banned in the previous century, similar protests had declared that the religion was in trouble, that Hinduism was drowning. But now, he says, subsequent generations had seen the wisdom in that ban. He then goes on to use the rhetorical strategy of caricaturing foreign places, and by implication, Anglo-Western countries. There, he argues, women seek divorce for really frivolous reasons, such as if the husband's weight increases, or if he does not stick to an agreed number of daily kisses. found that extremely interesting, daily kisses. The courts, he notes, grant women such divorces for such reasons. And he states that such practices do undermine social stability. However, he mocks them, and what he's doing is he's presenting his own views as relatively reasonable. He also denounces the customary form of separation called kadi modne, and he says that is actually potentially threatening to Hindu society because it is too easily available. So what Devdar does is he focuses on articulating a new and limited legal right that is distinct from existing customs. And by leaning on authoritative Hindu sources or scriptures, he mounts a more conservative case for divorce. A more radical case for women's right to divorce appears in the pages of Stree in the following year, in April 1933, with the Marathi translation of a manifesto produced by the All India Women's Conference on the heels of the Lucknow meeting of this organization. Those of you who are familiar with women's history know that this was one of the major pan-Indian women's organizations. It consisted of representatives from across the country, and its goal was to promote women's welfare and education, and it held annual conferences. So after its 1931 conference, it published a manifesto, and that manifesto was translated and republished in Stree. And its title was Bharatiya Stree Jahirnama, or Indian Women's Manifesto. And those who are also in the field of women's history, as I am, often think of AIWC as a gathering of largely elite women. So it's interesting when you look at the actual demands. The manifesto covers several realms of independence and freedom, and it focuses on economic independence as the primary goal, followed by overcoming gender segregation and access to education. Significantly, one of the rights that it calls for is divorce on demand. And it's presented as part of a list of other core demands. These are the things that they believe all women need to have in order to achieve their rightful place in society. So alongside equal opportunity in employment, equal wages for equal work, the right to abortion and medical care, the right to vote, it also puts divorce as a core demand. A more granular justification for legalizing divorce appears in another opinion piece in 1943, and this is an article written by Chandrakala Hate, who's a feminist sociologist. And she uses this illustration that shows couples who are, or a husband and wife who are literally tied to one another but are walking in opposite directions. She sees a lot of unhappiness among couples. And she notes that people often wonder why such couples are even together. And she says that when they're asked that, they say, Brahma tied our knot. Now, although this may sound like a generic expression of fatalism, it also actually evokes the term Brahma Vivaha, which was a reference to a particular kind of marriage, the marriage that is arranged by parents. Such couples needed courage, Hati argued, to be able to break free from bad situations. Hate's greatest concern was about husbands who took second wives, and she offers a detailed account of how men's bigamy is destroying families. At the time, the B.N. Rao committee was focused on outlawing bigamy, but what she says is that it's not enough to outlaw bigamy. Wives must also be able to access legal divorce. If husbands have been allowed to take second wives, then first wives should be allowed the right to divorce them. So these four opinion pieces show the range of varying positions. Chitale, who's speaking in the first person, she's talking about a fictional divorce, and she's tentatively saying, this looks like a good idea. Then you have Devdhar's Hindu scriptural rationalization. And then you have the All India Women's Conference's radical justification for the necessity of divorce. And then you have Hate's very concrete focus on the conditions under which second wives live. But for me, what was most poignant, or more poignant than these opinion pieces, were the letters to the editor. Unlike the opinion pieces that I've just described, These were direct pleas for help. In the third year of its publication, Stree began a forum that focused on readers called Mazhe Vaivahit Jeevan, which means my married life. And the editor said that the mission of this particular part of the journal was, or of the magazine, was laying out with openness the real face of married life. So, Mazhe Vaivahit Jeevan. And then the second section that also focused on letters from readers was called Parityaktanse Prashna. So this is questions from deserted women or abandoned women. The letters that arrived in this series depict extremely challenging situations. So in one letter, a woman who calls herself Sau Durdevi Rangu, or Mrs. Unfortunate Rangu, finds herself in a joint household, who is condemned to doing housework constantly, harassed by her in-laws, seeking an education, prevented from doing so, and married to a man who sleeps, she says, day and night, and spends most of his time with friends, and has a mountain of debt. Another letter by a newly wedded wife says that she's been insulted and treated as a simpleton by the family that she's married into. When she went to her natal home to deliver her first baby, she was not invited back by her husband's family, and he went on to marry a second wife. And so in both these cases, the writers are beseeching the editors and the readers to think of divorce as a solution to their problems. The second letter closes by saying, Ghatasphota Surya Kadhi Ugvel To Sudin. When divorce dawns, that will truly be a good day. So men left their first wives and remarried so often that there was actually this term, parityakta, for abandoned or deserted women. The letters that came in on this particular topic were also quite moving. So one letter from February 1936 is the narrative of a woman who was born into a wealthy family and whose family thought it was a good match. But when she joined their household, she found herself harassed. Her husband had a law degree, but he sought no actual work at the courts. He used to just go in the mornings and come back in the middle of the day to play cards, and then he ultimately had an affair with another woman. Some situations are clearly intended to arouse outrage. So a letter from December 7th, 1937, details a case of extortion. A woman who was betrothed to a man but did not actually live with him, went on to complete her medical degree and worked as a doctor, but then once she started earning money, was visited on a regular basis by this man who demanded money from her for all kinds of reasons, including the wedding of the daughter he had from his second marriage. She explained that she got married at a young age in order to fulfill the dying wish of her mother, because her mother's views were old-fashioned, and her father then requested a delay in joining her marital family until she finished her matriculation exams. However, the in-laws demanded that she not do the exams because the husband had only studied until the third standard, and they didn't want his wife to be more educated than him. The letter writer then says she refused to join the family. Her family approached the community court, the Panch of their caste, to adjudicate, and the Panch gathered and gave their permission to the man that she was betrothed to marry someone else. And so he went on then to have 7 children with the second person. The letter writer herself then went on to complete her medical education. She got not only an MBBS, but also an FRCS in Britain. And now she was working in a women's hospital, and she had a salary of 700 rupees per month. But after her husband found out about her job, he began to harass her and constantly claimed that his own financial situation was fragile. At first, she sent small sums of money, but now he had started to come to the bungalow a few times every year, demanding larger and larger sums, or else threatening to announce to everyone that he was her husband. So she was writing to the magazine saying she needed a divorce, not because she wanted to marry again, because she said she was too old to do so, but simply because she didn't want other women to suffer as much as she did. Another collection of letters also uses similar sorts of examples of personal tragedies, but there are less privileged individuals, and this is the series called Mismatched Couples that's published between 1939 and 1942. One letter from February 11th, 1941, describes a woman who was forced to marry at the age of 12 or 13 a man with mental illness. She describes herself as a village girl who learned to read and write at the age of 5, and she drew inspiration from the many texts that she read. So she says, I always thought that like heroines such as Sita, Damayanti, Rukmini, and Subhadra, I should be able to choose my own husband. Unfortunately, though, her father insisted on her marrying a wealthy man because he wanted to make a respectable lady of her, she says, he did his duty, but I fell into an ocean of sorrow. Her groom turned out to be not good looking, not educated, to have addictions, and then he became mentally ill. Her father initially paid for the mental health treatment, brought him to his house, thinking that the supervision would help, but nonetheless, the groom remained physically, mentally weak, intellectually dull, now I'm quoting her, unstable, unable to trust others, and uninterested in everything. When he overheard her declaring to her father that she was not going to join him, meaning her groom, in his home, and the father replying that he would not force her to do it against her wishes, the groom left the house, left town without informing anyone. So now the girl was at her father's house with no hopes of receiving the education that her father was providing to her brothers, and she says all that she receives is food and 2 saris a year. So she asks, I've come to know that it's possible to get a divorce in Baroda. Could I get a divorce there? She then says that if she cannot get a divorce, her only option is to join a residential school for orphan girls. And she asked the editor, please send me a letter of reference because then I can go to an orphan girls' school. While the desperation in her voice is clear, what is also notable in this story is her dream of being in a position to choose her own groom and her spirited insistence that she not be sent to live with her betrothed. Also, it's significant that she lists the groom's physical appearance among her complaints and not just his intellectual and emotional challenges. The next letter is from the 26th of February, 1942. It's written by a woman whose marriage at age 15 also took place against her wishes to a man who was in his 50s who had a first wife and a daughter. This situation torments her. She notes that he comes from a wealthy family, and this means that there are more controls over her movement and her thoughts. And she complains, I'm aware that Hindu scriptures have left no other recourse than killing oneself to be free from such suffering. And she reflects on the nature of justice. She says, an unjust action gets support even from learned and balanced men. But if someone takes a step that is just, there is such a hullabaloo about morality, religion, and culture. The best way to get out of this situation is a divorce. But that will be the day when this law is applicable to the whole of India. And there she's referring to the current law in Baroda. So I'm going to be sharing maybe 2 or 3 more letters before wrapping up. The third letter that Joshi presents is from a school teacher whose friend discovered a few days after the wedding that her husband had 3 or 4 girlfriends. So this woman left him and said to him, well, you don't need a wife. And she returned to her natal home. Her father passed away from shock a few days after that. And then she was burdened with educating her brothers. Because of that, she worked at a school, and she used her economic responsibilities as an excuse to explain to the world why she lived apart from her husband. But as her friend describes it, she now became a serious person who did not smile again. So the friend asks the editor, "Some say a law of divorce has been passed in Baroda. If my friend spends a few days in Baroda, she could get a divorce. How many days must she spend there? Does she have to buy property there? How much will it cost her?" So Rajaratna Joshi, the person who had compiled many of these letters, doesn't offer legal advice in response because he's not a lawyer, he's a novelist. But these letters are important from the perspective of legal history because of the specific queries about Baroda. So as I mentioned earlier, Baroda was run by an unusually progressive royal family, the Gaekwads, who led modernization efforts in many realms, and they were the first in the country to make divorce legal in 1931, primarily because of the efforts of Maharani Chimnabai Gaekwad, who was also the first president of the All India Women's Conference. Stree did also run a column called Legal Advice, or Kaideacha Salla, from early in its publishing history. Now, unlike the letters to the editor that I have just shared with you, that give us a lot of different detailed narratives and life stories of those who are seeking a divorce, this column had a more focused set of questions. So these questions give us a sense of the concerns that readers had. So for example, in April 1942, this is a time when Bombay had not yet legalized formal divorces. This column is explaining how customs such as farkat ghene or the sword chitti work. A letter writer explains that in her agricultural community, men were allowed to leave their wives and take a second wife following a custom called farkat. And her husband did that because she refused to give up her job working in her school. So the husband now had a second wife and a second family. So when her father approached the man to issue a sword chitti to allow her to proceed with her own life, the man refused, and he asked for 700 rupees. In response, the lawyer who is offering legal advice says that customs such as these are allowed in some castes, but these customs have not been formalized in the law, so the man cannot be compelled to issue a sword chitti. So the family is at the mercy of his demands for money. Until he does issue a sword chitti, his rights as a husband stay in place. The advisor observes that sometimes desperate women issue notices in the newspapers or get notarized letters sent by registered mail to their husbands, declaring that since they have not lived with their husband for a long time, he no longer holds rights over them. The legal advisor, however, cautions that such unilateral declarations of separation from one side actually cannot hold up before the law, and that if the woman proceeds to marry after such a declaration, she could actually be accused of engaging in an extramarital affair. There is one additional legal angle that the legal advisor also offers. The advisor says that because the woman is legally married to her husband, she actually can still seek spousal support or maintenance or potangi from him. And if the man earns enough to be able to pay for it, it is something that she can rightfully seek. And finally, here are a few shorter examples of questions and answers from the legal advice column. And what I found really interesting about these questions and answers was how sobering they were. There is a lot of advice that's available, and at this point it's August 48, right after divorce has become legally available in Bombay. That happened in 1947. And there's a flood of curious questions sent to the magazine about what this new legal change means. So here are some examples. My marriage took place against my will, and I have only completed college until inter-year, and I do not like my husband. I want to continue studying. Can I seek a divorce? The response, no. One cannot ask for a divorce simply because one doesn't like the spouse. Incompatibility is not a valid reason, wasn't a reason under the Bombay 1947 law. Then, I don't have this is a man writing, I don't have the consent of my first wife for my second marriage. Can I remarry? Short answer, you cannot. Then I married outside my caste, and my caste panchayat will not acknowledge the marriage and wants me to pay a 250 rupee fine. What kind of help can you offer? The response, congratulations on marrying outside your caste, but our society has not yet become enlightened. We'll need to change attitudes, and effectively it says that you won't be able to, if you're doing it according to the rules of the caste panchayat, you'll have to follow those rules. Okay, let me go. I thought I didn't have time for this, but I think I do. So one more example is a longer narrative. This is a girl who was married at the age of 11 or 12, and she's narrating what happened. She says, I threw off my wedding garland in the middle of the ceremony. That's how opposed I was to the whole thing. And then she says, a while later, the husband's family quarreled with my family. My mother-in-law beat me. I miscarried my baby during childbirth. I fell ill. Nobody helped me in those 2 years. I took a nursing maternity health course. My husband is a farmer and lives with his parents, and he's dominated by his parents. I cannot live in the village, and I cannot agree with his uneducated views. I have started a nursing home. Now my husband wants to bring me back to the village. I've asked for a sword chitti. They are asking for rupees 2,000 a month from me, and I have my son with me. Can they do this? Now for this, he said, no, they cannot ask for payment for sword chitti. So moving on to the conclusion. So these letters, articles, opinion pieces made for very moving reading for me. They conveyed the voices of people who are struggling with sometimes impossible dilemmas. Whereas the magazine's editor's imperative may have been to produce entertaining reading, and that's why they may have chosen letters that were more likely to prompt outrage, it's clear that there were persistent patterns in the letters that were being sent to this magazine. And so we can conclude that there is a pattern or a set of common challenges that were shared by women. So stepping back from these articles and letters, what is the portrait that emerges of Indian women who are seeking divorce, or Hindu women who are seeking divorce? I see an archetype forming, that of a woman whose marriage is arranged against her will at an early age, who then discovers, upon joining her conjugal family, that her husband has serious problems, but then she's prevented from leaving because of social taboos or because the conjugal family is predatory and seeking money in exchange for her freedom. Many women were also being forced to become second wives against their wishes. For them, all of these women, the option of seeking divorce through the law, even in a neighboring princely state of Baroda, came as a truly welcome relief. It is relevant then, in retrospect, that a key feature of the Hindu Marriage Act that was passed in 1955 was its creation of a matrimonial offense called cruelty. And this was added as a justification for divorce, apart from the mental instability of a partner, or adultery or bigamy by the partner, or religious conversion. The legal system recognized cruelty as a possibility in the way that the institution of arranged marriage worked at the time. So what do we make of this sort of emphasis on cruel scenarios? So when I was stepping back, it struck me that so many of the stories that were told in accounts advocating for divorce, used egregious or worst case scenarios, those that even the most hard-hearted readers had to sympathize with. Effectively, though, Stree and the content that I've shared with you was setting quite a high bar for being able to claim divorce, right? So those who may have wanted to divorce for other reasons, for a variety of reasons, weren't able to access it, because allowing for divorce only under conditions that were highly limited and focused on these worst case scenarios basically limited the range of options that were available, and they likely also reinscribed the stigma associated with divorce. Divorce effectively was being seen as generally unacceptable and only possible under very extreme conditions. Nevertheless, we can also see a new kind of figure emerging in the pages of Stree. A desperate but spirited woman, driven to seeking an education or a vocation, unsatisfied with just minimal economic support, and seeking an attractive companion and someone who could be an intellectual equal. So I'll stop there. It's 7:15, and that leaves half an hour for questions. So thank you very much for your patience.
Does anyone have any questions for our speaker?
And if you could introduce yourself as you pose the question, that would be wonderful.
Questions or comments? Anything?
I'm Jasmine. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk, and I think so. It's very timely with the Uniform Civil Code discussion happening in India right now. And I've actually been talking to some feminists in the morning, and I'm a Christian and a minority, and I get very scared when conversations of Uniform Civil Code starts, because it's always based on Hindu Marriage Act. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting for me to realize that divorce as a concept, or there was so much of conversation happening around Hindu divorce. I had no idea until I came for this talk. So in a way, I really liked the way it was titled, Palatable. So, because even I have been trying to figure out, if Uniform Civil Code does happen in this country, and for a lot of women, it might be the way to go ahead, but I still find Hindu divorce at the current version, it's still very limiting, those, the kind of clauses the law currently provides. So, but looking at the journey that it has gone through, this seems like a huge ask. But this was in 1930s. And I'm talking in 2023, so around 100 years. But it's surprising for me, because when this debate happens, nobody talks about, that Hindu law had to go through so much of revolution. There was so much argument within. Because right now the debate is like, Muslim law has a problem, and Hindus and Christians were very progressive throughout. So it's an historical reflection. It's very interesting. But I'm also asking, if we are asking or even defining divorce, what is, this is lack of imagination happening right now for me, but what should we ask? Because as a majority of this country, I'm a little scared that, it goes back to Hindu Marriage Act, and there is I don't think there's any imagination in that act. But looking at these letters, and if in 1930s girls are talking about ugliness, it's a huge revelation for me that girls were demanding back then. How do we make those demands I'm just putting out all the thoughts I have, because I've been discussing about UCC in the last 2-3 days, and really trying to figure out how do we move out of this Hindu-Muslim debate, and how do we bring the women in the center, all the minorities, all the sexual minorities. How can we ask for something more out of marriage laws?
Thank you. Thank you for that fantastic comment. Could you tell me your name, please?
Jasmine.
Jasmine, thank you so much. I loved your reflections on the dilemmas of the present. And, my talk has been focused on historical reflections, so I'm not going to venture too deeply into the specifics now, but I generally agree with you that, in principle, the idea of a uniform civil code may be appealing for many reasons, because it makes life simpler, actually, for a lot of women, but the devil is in the details, right? And whose norm are we deciding is the standard for everyone? And that is something you're clearly aware of, because you're saying there is a risk of majoritarianism, that we're going to fall back to a Hindu norm and say it's universal for everyone, or that's the uniform civil code that everybody has to follow. So I think there is a danger there that we have to be aware of, and as you say, I think the focus has to be on specifically what will help the largest number of women. I would argue, just based on the examples that I've shared, that we should use we should move beyond thinking only about egregious scenarios or worst case scenarios as justifications for divorce, and imagine a wider range. So sort of divorce by mutual consent was not something that came into being in 1955. It took another 20 years before it was even available. So we have to, first of all, engage in a lot of educating. I anticipated your question, so I was actually reading news articles to see what is the kind of feedback that has emerged in the last month in response to the proposal. And I was struck that many news articles actually contain a lot of historical inaccuracies. So the state of journalism actually is a little bit worrisome to me, that that a lot of history is actually not being told accurately. So I would argue that looking at the kinds of bold proposals that were made by Hindu women in the 1930s should be a signal to us that we shouldn't be settling for something that is less bold or less radical than what was imagined 100 years ago. Right? I hope that's addressing your question. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Jishnu. I have a couple of related questions. I think the first is to do with, in canon law, you have essentially a distinction between annulment, in which the marriage is not considered legitimate in the first place, separation, a legal separation, in which case the husband and wife physically separate, but there is still, essentially, the contract is not dissolved. There are some obligations on either side to one another, and divorce, which is essentially a license to remarry. Is there some kind of distinction which is drawn, understood, first of all, in the sort of traditional, I think, I can't pronounce it, Kadi, the sort of customary amongst lower castes.
Kadi mode, right.
Kadi mode, those ones. Also, what is being advocated, is there some kind of distinction in those three categories, or is there some other categories entirely? That's my first.
Yeah.
My second question is, this is in the context of Government of India Act 1935, which I believe, at least in Bengal, I'm not so sure about Bombay, offers a section of parliament reserved for women, I believe. Does that have a part in sort of changing legislative and lawmaking attitudes to this?
Great questions. Thank you. Thank you for these very well-informed questions. So Kadi mode is directly translated as separation and not divorce. And that is part of the reason why there was a real sort of drive to make divorce, as it was imagined, as a sort of a final license to remarry for both partners. What was happening in the context of Kadi mode was one partner was separating and going on to remarry, but the person who was left wasn't necessarily considered no longer married until they had a sod chitti. And so that's what made it a little bit tricky. So it's an in-between status. It's not what you identified as sort of scenario 3. In terms of your second question, absolutely. I think the increasing participation, electoral participation of women did play an important role. There was a great deal of advocacy by women's organizations, in fact, in the 1930s, as I say, for divorce. But, it was often the case, and this is not just true of India, it's true of many contexts of the world, when there is some kind of a nationalist uprising or fight underway, the struggles that women have are often put on pause because people are told, well, let's wait until the big goal is achieved of political independence and then we'll turn to these domestic issues. And this sort of, please keep your demands on pause until this other goal is achieved, is what happened. And what you find happening in the 1950s as the debates around the Hindu Code Bill are happening, it sort of really explodes in the face of Nehru. I mean, you've probably read about the conflict between Nehru and Ambedkar on the specifics of the Hindu Code Bill. This is the context, if you think about this is a newly formed nation. It's now a majority Hindu nation, and there's an effort to try and imagine and create a new nation based on sort of nationalist imagination of women as mothers of the nation, sort of reproducing correctly, producing future citizens. And in that context, divorce becomes a demand that isn't highly appealing. There's a lot of resistance that emerges. And a lot of it is sort of painting the demand for divorce as something that is, only important to cosmopolitan, urban women, and the same kind of problems that I identified, it's seen as something that only Western women are asking for. So even the women's advocates, there's a quote I have from Rameshwari Nehru in the 1950s. So she's an example of somebody who's, politically active women's leader. Even she says very, very tentatively, we should make divorce available, but it's not going to change things because very few people are actually going to avail of it. So they're not asking for it in a robust way, they're already on their back foot.
Thank you, Dr. Ashwini. First of all, it was very insightful. And what Jasmine also said about, her thoughts were very interesting.
Yeah.
What I have a question here is, while it's been around 80, 90 years now, this law, last was 1931 we are talking about, and now over these years, well, it'll be very interesting to see a perspective on how men also are being, traumatized. The entire discussion we've had today is around women. It's more skewed towards a women's perspective. I work with a lot of men. I'm a divorce recovery coach. Yeah. And I work with a lot of men also who are going through a lot of pain in the divorce that they are facing, right? Because the topic is divorce, I would rather, it has to be an equal discussion. I see here it's more skewed towards women. In the last 90 years, I believe there has a lot of progress which has happened, and today we're wanting to discuss men also on the platform, So it'll be interesting to see how men's perspective also come forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think in this context, what was interesting was that many of the people who were collecting letters, the editors, were also men, and they were trying to sort of play the role of advocating on behalf of women because they felt that not enough women were literate enough or had access to the resources that they did. But the reason that they were also advocating for women in this period that I discussed is because actually the ground was not a level playing field. Men were leaving wives and going on to marry quite freely, so much so, as I said, that there was actually a term for women who were abandoned or who remained married but were no longer considered full family members. They often worked as servants in the household. There were also, the sword chitti as a practice was also far more frequently used by men than by women. So if we think about, the context I'm looking at, it was definitely skewed in favor of men. They had many more degrees of freedom to be able to, arrange their lives in the way that they wanted. Now, your point about men finding divorce traumatic is very well taken, absolutely. I have no disagreement with that, and I commend you for the work that you do because I think helping people recover from traumatic life events is an important job. Has the scenario changed? Actually, I think it's interesting because you're absolutely right. I mean, men's rights groups have taken up divorce as one of the principal problems because many of them who are sort of in that position of sort of feeling great anger against the women's movement are those who find divorce and the fact that their wives have left them, the sort of principal trigger. And it's not only in India, but even in the United States where I teach and work, that you find sort of anger against divorce as a practice coming from a lot of men who, who could say unhappy with not being able to claim the same sets of rights or power that they had in the past. So I agree with you in theory that it should be sort of an equal discussion of men and women. In this context, it's clear to me why so many of the people who are writing letters to Stree about the problem of needing a divorce were women, because they were the ones who didn't actually have the freedom to leave their husbands.
It would be interesting for the modern age now if you're conducting a session around divorces, like probably a men's view equally would be very
Yeah, sure, yeah. And maybe you could propose something since you do the work.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is Subhash Devre.
Oh, hi, Uncle.
Hi. Yeah, so actually, great learning from your presentation,
Thank
first
you.
of all. And in my experience, divorce still has a stigma associated to
Yeah.
it in the Indian context. There is a lot of hush-hush gossip about it.
Yeah.
You know, even though it's become very common in the last 15, 20 years, I'm sure every person sitting here in this room has had friends, family members having, taken divorce. Now, and compared to the Western societies, the divorce rate is very, very significantly low in India.
Yeah.
I presume that statistics is right.
Yeah.
So is there anything Indian or Hindu about all this?
Great question. So, you're absolutely right that India is very different from many other parts of the world. In fact, India has one of the lowest divorce rates in the world. I think 1.1% of marriages end in divorce, whereas in the United States, it's closer to, I think, something in the 40% rate, right? So, huge difference. And one distinct difference that's pointed out by a lot of scholars is the way the institution of arranged marriage works, where because it's families that are sort of bringing together the two members of, or the two participants in the marriage, and because sometimes the wives are joining the husband's households, there are many social structures in place that make it difficult to leave. You're not just leaving one person, you're leaving a large number of people, you're leaving your source of economic support. Because marriages have also historically been arranged at a young age, it's also the case that people grow and develop into their adulthood imagining themselves only as married within that family, right? So their identities are formed in such a way that make it impossible to dream otherwise or imagine otherwise. So one of the really interesting things that a scholar named Srimati Basu has argued is that you could actually call marriage compulsory in India because it is so widely practiced that not being married or refusing to marry is something that takes so much effort that we can actually sociologically think of Indian society as one where marriage is compulsory. And so really my brief answer to you about what is distinct about India really is the institution of arranged marriage that has, I think, contributed to the very low divorce rates. I should say this by sort of with a caveat that it's not just in India that arranged marriages occur. It is definitely the case that you find marriages taking place in other parts of the world, and historically the royalties around the world have practiced arranged marriage, where families are sort of using marriage as a part of a system of exchange and alliance building. But there is definitely, I think India definitely stands out for how widely arranged marriage has been practiced.
Is there anything new about?
About arranged marriage?
No, about the stigma associated with divorce and
that's
low rates, etc.
I wouldn't say that the stigma is restricted only to Hindus. It is true that in Islam, marriage is imagined as a contract, as a contractual relationship, and not a sacrament. So there are many more detailed types of separation available for women and men, and the terms are explained in very formal ways. But of course, there still remains a stigma. I don't think you could argue that there is no stigma associated with being divorced in, for Muslims in India. And I think the same is true even for people in other communities. So I don't think the stigma alone is a Hindu issue or problem. Yeah. I'm going to just ask, there was someone else in the back who had their hand. Sure.
A statistic which you shared, 1.1%. I read somewhere that a lot of it comes from the fact that marriages are not even registered in India, a lot of those. And also, secondly, when we are going to take a divorce, a lot of, the uneducated, probably they see divorce as entire legal battle as such a taboo or not going to the laws. They actually take divorces by signing stamp papers, right? They don't want to, and it is a mutual agreement also in the lower rung. You don't see me, I don't see you, you get married to another wife, I'll get married to another husband. It's a mutual agreement. So there is officially no record of divorce and also no official records of marriage. So while we may be at 1%, but being married is different from being happily married. And that's the difference the Western culture has understood.
Thank you for your contributions. I think I saw a hand up there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Vijay. The topic making Hindu divorce palatable, the palatable word itself, why can't we making Hindu marriage palatable? And the very image of that Mangal Sutra, I mean, it's, when I walked in, when I saw that, it was a sort of a negative vibe in that, like.
Sorry, could you say that again?
It's a negative vibe. I mean, the Mangal Sutra coming out there. So making Hindu marriage palatable. Because I'm happily married for 32 years. I got 2 daughters. Elder one is getting married soon, but she has not taken the decision yet. She has got so many doubts and things like that. So why can't we have a positive take on that, like?
A positive take on marriage? Or
Marriage, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Why not? I mean, I don't know if you were here at the beginning. Were you here at the beginning? Yeah. So I shared with you examples of how this magazine was celebrating romantic bliss, a new vision of marriage, and couples who were engaged on equal terms with household duties. Sorry, I don't have the slides, but so the point I was trying to make is that it's really interesting. It's when people start to imagine happy marriages that then unhappy marriages become much more intolerable, right? So this is a moment when the idea of marriage is being reimagined as a companionship, a companionate arrangement, and that is the context in which then Stree starts to also start to talk about, divorce as an option if you're not able to find this kind of happiness. Now, about the publicity, I'm afraid that image is not something that I chose, but I actually think it was quite a good choice because the Mangal Sutra does connote the Marathi context because it is very commonly worn by Marathi women. Yeah, well, it's much more commonly found among people in Maharashtra, I think, than in many other parts of the country. So I imagine that's why the folks at BIC chose that particular image, right?
Thank you.
So, yeah. And congratulations on 35 years of happy 32, yeah.
Sorry, I had one more question. So I missed the first 10 minutes, so maybe you covered in that. I didn't realize if there's a Marathi or a local word for divorce. So that is something, because I was also surprised in 1930s, if 56 is the time Hindu Marriage Act was codified, I'm not sure if there was any law or, codes other than Manusmriti. So the very concept of divorce or the idea of separation, because in Christianity, divorce is sin.
Yeah.
So it's not even, bad or it's sin. So you will be thrown out of church. So I was very surprised that how did that term come about? Was there a local term? How did these girls start speaking about this very idea? Because a man leaving a relationship and going for sannyas is something codified, but a woman leaving and doing anything else? Was it even part? Because when you had mentioned about Manu even mentioning where it's allowed to remarry, I didn't know about it. So maybe in the first 10 minutes, I didn't miss that part. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Happy to sort of recap some of what I said. So, Ghatasphot was a new word that came into circulation in this period, and there was a novel that was written in 1930 that used it in its title. It was called Bandhamukta, which means freedom from constraints, but it was about Ghatasphot, and it used the word. And the goal, I think, in this Marathi context, Marathi literary public culture, was to imagine something that was different from the prior forms of separation that were available among some castes. So I mentioned Kadi mode, which is practiced among Marathas, means breaking of the twig, but it's more a separation. And I think what was being pointed out by those who were arguing for Ghatasphot was a much more formal legal category that both people could ask for, and that was freeing up both parties to then remarry, because until that point it was practiced unevenly. So Ghatasphot was, I think, an indigenized word for divorce. And when you read the content of Stree, the interesting thing is they use Ghatasphot when they're referring to divorce, and they only use the word divorce when they're describing what's happening in Anglo-American context. And they're trying to do that in order to indigenize it and say, well, this is something that is, we should also be able to do. But they're worried that using the word divorce makes them seem overly Anglicized and not authentically Indian.
I think we have time for one last question here.
Yeah, this is Shalini Saxena.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Ashwini, for such a lovely session. While I was just going through and reminiscing what all you said during the lecture, I just noticed that most of the letters by these women were either whoever educated or had a financial independence or had a backing from their parental family who were not throwing them out and giving them an option. So I think economic independence has a great, great role to play in getting divorce and getting the divorce rates higher also. Because in today's society also, we feel that a woman would probably ask for a divorce if she's not worried about how will she make her ends meet. Exactly. And another short point about the number of divorce rates in India, when you see in our slums, in our lower income groups, they will not even go to register the marriage, and they will not even go. So they're happily breaking marriages, remarrying, triple marrying, or whatever, without being recorded. And sometimes the taboo comes to the burdened middle class, that typically, and that's lovely the way Stree is depicting the middle class of Maharashtrian community in that era. Thank you again.
No, thank you. Thank you for that really astute observation about both economic independence and sort of the caste politics of this phenomenon. And that's what Dr. Ambedkar was also saying when he was saying we need to formalize this access to divorce because it's already practiced so widely. So why is it such a big deal to have a law that codifies divorce? And you're absolutely right that the court system makes it so torturous, it's so expensive, long-winded, that many people would prefer not to, if they found other paths, right? And Flavia Agnes, a feminist scholar, has actually argued that, divorce then in this sense is actually an aspiration of people who are upwardly mobile in terms of their caste status because they seek to have, they seek to assimilate to upper caste norms. And it's primarily in upper caste settings where it was much harder to break free of the marriage. And one more point I wanted to just sort of make to emphasize what you just said. In much of the sort of discussion of marriage, those who are arguing for divorce, they describe marriage not just as a union between two people. They describe it as a woman's livelihood, right? You stay married because that is your only means of economic survival. And I think that answers the question partially also that you were asking, Subhash Kaka, about why it is that we find divorce so stigmatized, or why is it that divorce rates are so low. It's because in the absence of genuine economic opportunities, and particularly for upper caste, upper class women whose primary role is to raise future children and who are forbidden sometimes from working outside the home. The marriage is their only means of you could say livelihood.
Ashwini Tambe, thank you for sharing these historical personal narratives from sources such as Stree and for bringing this aspect of Indian history to focus today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sneha. I want to also just commend Bangalore International Center on providing such a fantastic space for an open exchange of ideas. It's truly a major contribution to, public intellectual life in Bangalore, and I'm so glad that it's here. It wasn't here when I was in college in Bangalore, and I really wish it had been around, because I love being able to share the research that we're doing in universities with wider audiences and not just the people we teach and we write for in articles, and I think you've really created something amazing here. So thank you again for hosting me today, and Vikram, again, thank you for your warm and prompt invitation.